This part will answer what is culture. All people have the same basic needs and wants, such as food. We all need clothing. We all need shelter. But different cultures respond to those needs and wants in different ways. We learned a little bit about this with economics. Our economy is part of our culture in the way that we meet our needs. Culture is the beliefs, customs, practices, and behaviors of a particular nation or group of people. Where culture comes from. The features that make up a culture are known as cultural traits. A cultural trait is an idea or a way of doing things that is common in a certain culture. Cultural traits include language, laws, religion, values, food, clothing, and many other customs. Children learn cultural traits from their parents and other adults. People also learn cultural traits from the mass media, so TV, radio, online now, and from organizations such as schools. You spend a lot of time there learning from each other, social clubs, and religious groups. Common cultural traits are called norms. A norm is a behavior that is considered normal in a particular society. A norm can be that we greet each other with a smile or we wave to say hello. Be sure to read the edges. There are some important yellow highlighted words. So to understand, there are culture regions within a country. A culture region is an area in which a single culture or cultural trait is dominant. You can tell when you travel to that area. In Canada, the French Canadian culture dominates much of the province of Quebec. So Quebec is a culture region, a French culture region. The people of Quebec who have this culture identify themselves as French Canadian. So it's a French Canadian culture region. They speak French and they pronounce it or Quebecois, which is French for Quebec. They have many of the traditions because the French settlers settled there first, and over the hundreds of years since the first settlers, they have kept French ways, while the British settled around in Ontario and the eastern part of Canada. Quebec remained very French, including the language, the schools, the restaurants prepare food in a French way. So they're a culture region within Canada that's different than the rest of the country. Going down to a cultural landscape. Human activities create cultural landscapes or geographic areas that have been shaped by the people. In Bolivia, the ancestors of the Inca, the ancient Inca, they built terraces on the side of mountains. That's a cultural landscape. It shows how they farm. They still farm those terraces today, very much as the ancient Inca did hundreds of years ago until the Spanish arrived and took over. So looking at some of these pictures, often you can identify cultures when you look at those pictures or kind of guess what region of the earth that culture is from the clothing, from the foods, from different cultural traits that you identify. Some cultural traits remain constant over many years, but culture can change over time as people adopt new cultural traits. For example, the way Americans dress today is very different from the way Americans dressed 100 years ago. The environment can also affect culture. For example, the environment of a region influences how people live and how they earn their living. Humans can also shape their environment by creating cultural landscapes, like skyscrapers can be a city, a cultural landscape. Urban culture, city culture can be very different because you have to carry things up to 100 floors through an elevator. So you don't buy groceries in big carfuls like we do. You buy a few bags at a time. The cultural landscape of a place reflects how its people meets their basic needs for food, clothing, and shelter. These landscapes differ from one culture to another. Culture and geography. Earth has thousands of different cultures and culture regions. This makes traveling so interesting. You learn and see part of different cultures. In a specific culture region, people share cultural traits such as religion or language. Culture regions are often different from political units. Occasionally, a culture region may cover an entire country. In Japan, for example, Japan is a country of islands. They were isolated for years. Nearly everyone speaks the same language. eats the same food, and follows the same customs. And they're smaller because they're islands, but they have a large population. They're very densely populated, like what we saw in Tokyo. A country may also include more than one culture region. So, for example, Canada has had many different immigrant groups. The French had settled there, the French fur traders, and then the British won the land, but they let the French continue to have the French culture. So Quebec is a French Canadian region, but they're all under the Canadian government. So a culture region can be different than just the boundaries of a country. Some countries have been isolated, like Iceland, very much has culture, their language, very similar to what the ancient Vikings. And because they're on an island, not a lot of people travel through there or migrate to it because it's so cold. It's up in the Arctic Circle almost. So they remain, their culture on the island remained very kind of isolated and all similar religions, similar families related. And Japan was very similar to that too. People didn't migrate through the islands because they're kind of remote and they were on the island. So their culture kind of developed one culture instead of all the different immigrants that came to America. In the United States, we have several cultural regions. Yesterday, I was in just in Grand Rapids, and I remembered that many immigrants came to Grand Rapids to work in the furniture factories in the 1800s. And in the Northwest side, it was largely Polish families who came from Poland and lived on that side. A lot of those families have since moved from that area, and now immigrants come from Latin American countries. So it's become largely, the signs have changed and the area has changed, where it's largely a Hispanic neighborhood. And where schools in Grand Rapids, I subbed in different schools in Grand Rapids when I was first starting to teach a few years ago, 20 or so years ago. And there were schools in Grand Rapids where the neighborhoods were Hispanic and they spoke Spanish in the schools. So those are culture regions within the city of Grand Rapids even. Culture regions can also extend beyond political boundaries. For example, many of the people who live in Southwest Asia and Northern Africa are Arab Muslims. So religion can be a culture region. That is, they practice the religion of Islam. They are also share cultural traits such as the Arabic language, foods, and other ways of life. This region of Arab Muslim culture covers several countries. So Syria, Libya, Northern Africa, the Muslims spread through Northern Africa. So they actually have what would be in the Middle East, the Arab Muslim Egypt. They're all part of the Arab Muslim countries. Make sure you read all of the pictures and the borders because it teaches you about culture.